we're going to bring on Todd now. Welcome, Todd. Thanks for joining us today.
Good to be here.
All right, so let's start about last week. WPC on the Go was focused on House Bill 1589, I believe is the number, and that was
Yep.
effectively the natural gas ban. Do you want to recap what that did and where it went in terms of legislative action and how that played out?
So it was a bill specifically for Puget Sound Energy. Puget Sound Energy provides both electricity and natural gas to customers. And what the bill allowed them to do is to not serve people with natural gas anymore. This was basically a way to comply with the Climate Commitment Act, which is the CO2 tax, which is the cap on total emissions. And so what they argued was they needed this to make it easier to achieve the requirements of the Climate Commitment Act, the CCA. So it allows them to increase rates, change rates, do a variety of different things in there. What's so interesting is that the Sierra Club and some other folks are saying it doesn't go far enough. And they are actually encouraging the governor to veto individual portions of the bill to make it more strict, to force people to basically end the use of natural gas. There's a variety of problems with this. We've seen already the high costs and some of the intended and unintended consequences of the CCA. But what's absurd about regulations like this is that they don't add anything to CO2 emissions reductions. The purpose of a cap and trade system, which we have, you put a cap on total CO2 emissions, and then you're allowed to trade allowances, right? If you can reduce more, you can sell allowances to others. If you can't, you can buy them from other. That theoretical flexibility in the CCA and cap and trade systems makes it so that you can achieve the goal at lowest cost. But the legislature, of course, there is a sort of a sugar high in showing that you care about climate change and constantly passing more bills to show that you care about climate change. And then also to deal with the problems you've created from this very strict cap and trade. So rather than letting a cap and trade system work, where it's just like, we don't care how you reduce CO2 emissions, just as long as you do it. What the legislature keeps doing is saying, no, actually, we want you to reduce CO2 emissions in this way and this particular way. And we want you to do this. And we want you to provide money for this special interest group. And oh, by the way, 1589 has a specific clause in it that the construction that is required to meet the CCA that Puget Sound Energy has to do has to be union labor. So what they do is they stick in all these things and it becomes vehicles for special interests. So that I think is why, right, the concern about losing natural gas is real in and of itself. The fact that the costs will go up, the fact that if Puget Sound Energy decides not to serve natural gas customers, that people would have to retrofit to heat pumps and a variety of other things to provide all the electricity. That's very expensive. But all of those costs, like if you could actually make an argument that those costs would be necessary if they achieved a goal. They don't. And just to put a fine point on this, I'm a Puget Sound Energy customer. I don't get my natural gas from them. I do get my electricity from them. I have a heat pump, but I have a propane backup. So I live in the mountains. In January, we had 4 days in a row where it was -10. I can tell you what my heat pump did. Basically nothing. I actually was getting warnings on my smart thermostat saying, we think your heat pump is broken because it just keeps turning and turning and turning and turning and not generating heat. It's like, yes, it's -10 outside. That's why. And so I had to have heat from my propane backup. So if you're talking about moving away from natural gas and toward heat pumps, that may be fine in Issaquah. That may be fine in Seattle, but in places where it gets colder, like Eastern Washington, that's going to be a big problem.
One question is from someone who is down in Clark County, and they're wondering if it's just Puget Sound or if this is going to trickle its way. Do you see it expanding at all?
So right now it's just Puget Sound Energy. It is likely just to be the investor-owned utilities like Puget Sound Energy, not Avista yet. They haven't done this. They've just done it for Puget Sound Energy. If you're in Clark County, I can't remember whether you're on a PUD or whether you're on an investor-owned, the name of which I'm forgetting, that is sort of in South Washington. But anyway, but if you're in a public utility district, you're not there yet.
Now, the way that you're describing this, it almost gives me echoes of the initial passage of the Climate Commitment Act, where they're assuring that there's one goal, which is to move towards sustainable and future, whatever. And part of that is by increasing cost. And then later they come out and say, oh, it's not going to increase cost. Has there been any sort of this denial of the increased cost this would have, that would incur? Or are they, like you said, the Sierra Club is saying, that it's not going far enough?
Yeah.
Is that, are we kind of in the stage where they're admitting it will drive up costs, and then maybe in the future they'll kind of say, no one could have seen this happen?
Right. Well, the Sierra Club doesn't care, right?
They don't. Sure.
Right. They think we should shut it all down. If they could ban cars tomorrow, they probably would. So they don't care. The question is, okay, how much will the rate increases, other things cost? That's somewhat speculative. And then the other issue is, if Puget Sound Energy chooses not to serve somebody, then what happens? And then would they have to retrofit? And then those costs are speculative. It's not just like, you can't just buy a heat pump and plug it in. You have to rewire, you have to do a whole variety of things.
Mm-hmm.
So the estimates are from BIAW, which is the Building Industry Association of Washington. They set it between 40,000 and 70,000 to retrofit a house that no longer could have natural gas.
And that, to be clear, is a small family home, as well as probably more expensive for businesses and bigger buildings as well, right?
Correct, but then like for an apartment, it could be different. I mean, so
Sure.
It's very hard to come up with concrete numbers, and so that's, I think, is the challenge with these things, is that you're trying to come up with an estimate of what the impact could be. But again, if you're doing a cost benefit analysis, those arguments about cost are meaningful. Okay, is it 40,000? Well, it's not really, it's 30,000. Oh, it's 70,000, right? But if there's no benefit, if there's no environmental benefit, the analysis is very simple. And again, this does nothing to reduce CO2 emissions over the laws we already have. This just basically says, we want you to do it in this very expensive way.
Wow. Well, the last thing I'll ask you on this then is, what does it look like in terms of the likelihood for Governor Inslee to sign it? I obviously there were some concerns with the way the bill was structured. The Attorney General kind of weighed in very quickly, saying it was okay to pass. What do you think in terms of, is it structurally sound? Is the governor likely to sign it? I mean, that's all speculative, but just from your impressions.
I'm not a lawyer, so don't, if it's not structurally sound, I am not the guy to ask. Will the governor sign it? Absolutely. The vote actually was held early in the morning, precisely because they didn't have the votes, precisely because Jay Inslee was calling people. And the reports are, and this question was put to the governor's press secretary, Mike Falk, and he did not deny it. He simply said, well, trade-offs are done all the time. But apparently the governor was calling key votes saying, I will veto every one of your bills if you don't vote for this bill. That's what the report was. Like I said, the governor's spokesman was asked about it. He did not deny it. So having gone through that, will he sign it? Absolutely. The question is, will he veto those sections that the Sierra Club wants?
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't put it past him. He has done it before. He has done illegal vetoes in the past, where he vetoes subsections, which is illegal, and the court has overturned him. So my guess is that the governor, having put all this effort in to an issue that he wants to be his legacy, the niceties of the legal guidelines are not going to constrain him, since they have not in the past.
Oh yeah, that's an unfortunate callback to Pirates of the Caribbean. They're more like guidelines anyway,
That's right.
Okay, well, let's move on. You've had a series of tweets that were joking about some of the doomer predictions coming from opponents of I-2117, which would repeal the Climate Commitment Act. What are the claims that are being made if the repeal happens? And why are they not true? Where are they pulling it from? Let's give some analysis.
Yeah. So I-2117 is the repeal of the Climate Commitment Act, the CO2 tax. And so the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee, Senator Marco Leas, has been tweeting out and making claims that if we repeal the CCA, that it would harm road construction projects like the North-South Corridor in Spokane, like Highway 18 outside of Issaquah and Sammamish, which is one of the most dangerous roads in the state, saying, oh, if we lose this money, we could lose these projects. This is absolutely false. This is completely false. And he knows it. In fact, the Climate Commitment Act specifically says that money cannot be used for any project that qualifies under the 18th Amendment of the state constitution. The 18th Amendment of the state constitution is the one that says that gas taxes are dedicated to road construction and road maintenance. Okay. The only potential overlap between what that says and what the CCA says is ferries, because ferries are part of the 18th Amendment, but the CCA specifically says that ferries can receive money because they want to electrify the ferry fleet. That is the only potential source. So when you're talking about the North-South Corridor in Spokane, when you're talking about Highway 18, when you're talking about lots of other things that are about road construction, claiming that repealing the CCA would impact those, simply false. Now, he might decide, and legislators might decide in a peak of anger at the voters for doing the wrong thing to, change funding on roads. But that has nothing to do with the revenue from the CO2 tax. That's just a temper tantrum. So we've pointed this out. Other legislators have pointed this out, that what he's doing is dishonest. So we decided that mockery was better than trying to make an argument, because everybody knows he's wrong, right? And everybody knows the facts, but he keeps doing it. So if you go to my Twitter feed at WA Policy Green, or maybe we can put it in the Q&A. I'll list a couple in the Q&A here. We decided to mock him because he had these very dangerous sounding tweets about the devastation that would be caused. So I tweeted out things like, if I-2117 is repealed, the devastation that is caused would cause Starbucks to only serve decaf coffee. And another one is if I-2117 is adopted and the CCA is repealed, the Seahawks will re-sign Russell Wilson. So just things like that, because it's all hyperbole, it's all nonsense. And when you're dealing with somebody who is so blasé about being dishonest, I think you have to sort of mock them.
You have been called the modern day Chaucer. I think your penchant for satire here is coming in handy. Well, let's steelman the argument and say, well, since money is fungible, money that would be coming in from the Climate Commitment Act to, say, electrify ferries or to put towards other renewable projects, that money now is not coming in, and therefore we have to divert money from these highway projects to these green projects. Is that maybe the sort of roundabout justification happening?
But the money has already been allocated from the gas taxes to Highway 18, to the North-South Corridor. We've been working on the North-South Corridor for more than a decade, right? The other thing is that electrifying ferries is optional. It's not required by anything. It's just they want to do it. And again, there's nothing. It's not like you say, okay, we have this bucket of taxes for this project, and then the bucket goes away. That's not what they're doing. What they're saying is, well, since we have some money here, right, we're going to do this optional thing. It's like, oh, we don't have the money? Oh, well, then we're going to kill your project so that we can do our optional thing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it is theoretically possible that legislators could punish the voters by killing favorable projects. but that is a choice. It is not a requirement.
It strikes me as very similar to the claims that were made about repealing the capital gains income tax, where some legislators claimed it would gut education spending and things like that. Whereas I think our vice president for research, Paul Guppy, rightly said the money is not, theirs at that point. If the projects are getting these funds based on projected income, they don't have them yet. You're not gutting something by taking away money you don't yet have. So it kind of seems like a similar thing here with the CCA and that kind of revenue.
It's sort of like saying that you have to buy something because it's on sale and it'll save money.
Yeah, if I don't do this buy one get one free, I'm losing money if I don't take advantage of that. I've justified many a carton of ice cream that way. Okay, so let's see. Oh, I wanted to ask you about the status of the bill that you had reported on that went pretty big. That was going to be $200 checks to low to middle income households from the Climate Commitment Fund. Where did that end up going? And there was timing about it where they wouldn't be sending it out if we voted to repeal the CCA. How is that currently?
So the CO2 tax generated way more money than they ever imagined last year. So they have this big pile of money sitting around. Well, now that there's an initiative on the ballot to repeal that, legislators who support the CO2 tax are trying to figure out what to do. So what they did is they put a proviso in the budget, and the House and Senate provisos were different, but both of them had $200 checks going to utility customers. And they started with low income, and then they basically, got as high up to the bill says low and middle income. So in the Senate, they just said, here's $150 or $150 million rather for utilities to send out $200 checks. The only requirement is that the checks had to be sent by the end of the year. The House, on the other hand, said, we're going to give $75 million. We're going to give $200 checks. We're going to allocate $75 million. The first checks have to go out 3 weeks before the election. They actually said October 15th, so 3 weeks before the election. And the second set of checks, which would go to higher or low and middle income folks, would be in come 2025. But if the voters repealed the CCA, repealed the carbon tax, the money wouldn't go on. And so it's obvious what they were doing was they were sending it out right before the election, and then they were holding half of it back to tell voters, well, if you vote against this, you don't get the money. So the majority leader for the Democrats, Joe Fitzgibbon, was asked about this, and he said, well, it'd be irresponsible for us to send out the second $75 million if we don't know the money is there. The problem with that is the Senate knew the money was there and was sending all $150 million. So he should have just called his colleagues in the Senate because they knew that the money was there. It was totally dishonest, totally disingenuous. It was just a game. It was just a hostage. So we pointed that out. In the final budget, the $200 checks are still there. All $150 million goes out this year, and the checks are required to be sent out in September. So not 3 weeks before the election like it was before, but a month and a half before the election, right? If they really wanted to, so a reporter asked me, okay, so Todd, how could you do this in a way that didn't seem political? And I said, send the checks out in December. Right? There'd be no question that they were intended to influence the election. People would get a little Christmas bonus, right, back on their taxes. So why not do it in December? Well, of course, they weren't going to do that. They sent it out in September. So it's still in there. This coming September, a certain number of people will get $200 checks that will tell them this is your refund from the Climate Commitment Act.
Also a little bit interesting that it's not happening even sooner, right? It seems like if the argument would be, well, people should have their money sooner, it feels like you could probably do sooner than September too, but that might be a little too far away from November to be feasible.
Well, and to that point, the money is in the account, right?
Yeah.
We already have the money from the CO2 tax. They could spend it, as soon as the governor signs it. There's nothing that prevents that.
Interesting. All right. Well, that is fun. I'm going to get to some questions from the audience here in a second. Last thing I just want to wrap up thematically here is let's talk about salmon funding. You had a lot of good pieces about ways that the legislature could address salmon recovery in smart ways, and I know there were a couple of different kinds of bills that would have targeted that. What ended up moving forward, and just to assuage any fears, was there any continued talk about removal of the lower Snake River dams?
Yeah, so the primary fight on removing the lower Snake River dams is now at the federal level. The Biden administration came up with a deal with tribes and other folks on how to address the Snake River dams, basically putting them on a path to be destroyed. This is what you call a sue and settle, where the tribes and other folks threaten to sue, and the Biden administration goes, oh no, don't sue us. We'll cut a deal with you. But of course, it's not an adversarial, right, a relationship. They are working together to try to come up with a deal, since the Biden administration has already said that they want to destroy the dams. So that's kind of where that fight is. It's going to be a long fight. Ultimately, at the end of the day, Congress would have to approve the money. But, the interesting thing about that settlement is that it obliges utilities and others to spend money to meet certain regulations. So it's a way to get government entities to spend money without having to appropriate it through Congress. So it's very sneaky. Anyway, in the legislature, and I'm actually writing about this, I'll post something later today, there was a real opportunity to make big progress on salmon recovery in Washington State. We had two things. One, we had a lot of extra money, as Chris mentioned, that there was a big surplus. And second, there was bipartisan support for acting, because salmon are not recovering, right? Chinook populations are really struggling in Puget Sound and elsewhere across the state, not just Chinook, but like other salmon. But Chinook tends to be, right, the main one that we focus on because it meets treaty rights, it's good for fishers, orca eat them, right? So lots of different reasons. So we had a really good opportunity, and we kind of squandered it. The only bills that passed on salmon recovery were pretty small. One allowing ecology to deal with a chemical called 6-PPD that's in tires that kills coho. It is a bad chemical. There's no doubt about it. University of Washington or Washington State University did really good research to show on how dangerous this chemical is to coho. Another bill that is a study on avian predation. Birds kill fish, right? So do seals and sea lions. We need to deal with that. We could spend a lot of money restoring habitat, but if all we are doing is feeding more birds and seals and sea lions, we're not going to make any progress. So we need to address that. It's important, but it's a study. It's not action. And then another project to adopt a culvert. So we have to replace culverts to open up habitat. And so sort of in the same way you can do adopt a road, you can adopt a culvert. Nice, not groundbreaking. That's it. That's what we did in terms of legislation. There was lots of legislation that would have streamlined permitting, that would have allowed salmon recovery projects to ask for regulation waivers to get things done, right? We put all these regulations on government salmon recovery projects. So government people doing government projects are having to go to other government agencies to ask for permits and waste time and money and things like that. That bill died. There was another bill that would address sewage in Puget Sound. That bill died. Given how partisan and divisive things are these days, when you have an opportunity where both parties are saying, yes, let's address salmon, and you do almost nothing, I think that's really a lost opportunity. The capital budget, there was more money put in, which I think is good, but that money is being held hostage. That money doesn't get spent until January 1st, 2025. And if the voters repeal the CO2 tax, that money goes away. There's no need to do that. The money is there. And then the operating budget was $2 billion, the supplemental budget. Of that $2 billion, they spent $1.4 million on salmon. Just to give you a sense of how paltry that is, that's 0.07% of the supplemental budget. But there's a line item for 1.4 million, the same amount, just to expand staff to deal with the CO2 tax. So you're spending as much money to expand government to implement the CO2 tax as you are in the operating budget, supplemental operating budget for salmon. Does that sound like it's a priority? It is not a priority. For as much as people talk about how much a priority is, if you spend $2 billion and 0.07% goes to salmon, that's just crazy. So look, I'm very reticent to say we should spend more money on things, but we could easily provide lots of tax cuts, lots of tax rebates and things like that, and still do something meaningful for salmon. And they did neither.
Well, it strikes me as this would maybe be an excellent but sad chapter for your, additional chapter for your book, Time to Think Small. Just examples of even when it's like teed up for them, it's very hard for them to take a swing to create some action. Okay, so we're getting close on time here, so I want to get to some of these questions that have been submitted. I'm going to work backwards on topics here. So first question on the Puget Sound Energy House Bill 1589. How soon do you think this will be implemented? What do you think do we know what the timeline is for this requirement for the natural gas ban to take effect?
The governor has to sign it, and then Puget Sound Energy has the authority. They are not required to use that authority. They have a bunch of now new tools, and how they use those tools is sort of up to them. So it's not like, July 1st, nobody gets natural gas.
Right.
So people shouldn't freak out. But like I said, these tools are now in place. Puget Sound Energy now has options that it didn't have before, and that could have an impact.
Okay. All right. And still on this topic here, we've got a question. Does Puget Power have the ability to supply all the needed energy required to replace all the energy supplied by gas? If not, then will PSE use gas to supply the needed electric? You've already stated that this bill provides no carbon benefit. Is there any way to fight to repeal this bill? So it's two questions there, kind of, I guess.
First, I appreciate you calling it Puget Power. That means you're as old or older than I am, since that was its old name, and it's now Puget Sound Energy. So I feel a kinship here. Okay, so the question is of if you switch from natural gas heating to electricity heating, that's going to increase demand. Do we have capacity? No. So in the bill, it talks about building more resources, more capacity, things like that. That's part of what's covered in the union requirements. That's why that's there. So it's anticipated that we need to build more. There are studies on resource capacity done by the Northwest Power and Conservation Council and others that show that we will need more electricity. We will need more electricity generation in the future. For rules like this, for more electric vehicles, for just simple economic growth. So we, in the near term, we're actually okay. Other regions of the country are already in trouble. We are not, thanks to hydro, frankly. Hydro is what is saving us because it's very flexible. That's not going to be the case for much longer.
Got it. And then was there any sort of action on repealing or backtracking this bill, or is it pretty much just up to the governor not signing, which sounded unlikely?
Yeah, so let me look at it. I saw an earlier version of the bill. Let me just double check it. I think that there is an emergency clause. An emergency clause would mean, yes. So it has an emergency clause. What that means is you can't do a referendum. A referendum, you can get many fewer signatures to put it on the ballot. An emergency clause says we have to do this right now, and it forces in order to repeal it, you'd have to put an initiative. An initiative requires, I think, double the signatures of a referendum. If I'm remembering correctly, I might be wrong on that, but it does. It's a lot more, and it's more difficult. So
an initiative's possible, but it's not an easy fight. Basically, it's not an easy
right. And they didn't do that. That's not on accident, right?
Yes,
they put that in that emergency clause in there to make it more difficult to repeal.
It's an emergency. We're going to have the same output of carbon because of our cap and trade laws anyway. It's an emergency. You don't get it.
Well, right. And as I said before, it's not, I mean, the rules in the bill are not going to take effect like the next day. They are going to be implemented over time. So the notion that it says this act is necessary for the immediate preservation of the public peace, health, or safety. No, it's not.
Okay. All right. Let's see. The next, we got two questions kind of on the same thing here. This is a little more technical. Do you know how they determined who counts as a little or middle, lower or middle income with no income tax? Is it just a survey of what people make, or is that for the $200 or payments out to CCA from the CCA funds?
So the way the bill does it is it actually puts the burden on the utility. So the utility says, here are the customers that we have that meet your qualifications. Give us this amount of money so that we can then pass it along to consumers. So the utility has customers that receive low income benefits, which called LEAP. No, LEAP, is that right? Anyway, no, LEAP is not right. Anyway, it's a low income, it's a energy program, getting my acronyms mixed up, but they're the ones who do it. So they say, here's how many customers we have, and they say, okay, here's the money.
Okay, let's see. We've got another question. I've seen a number of programs locally through the federal level about having tribes lead salmon recovery. In 2024, do tribes actually have the knowledge of how to restore salmon populations?
I think tribes are some of the best. I know that's not, some people don't like to hear that. That's not popular for some reason. But I think tribes are the best in many cases for a couple of reasons. First, many tribes, that's a source of revenue for them. That's a source of income. And so if you have tribal fishermen and there's no fish, they're going to go knock on the door of the head of their tribal resources department and say, where are my fish? I need fish to eat to make a living and things like that. That sort of direct government accountability we don't have in Washington State generally, right? If you don't have fish, like, what are you going to do? Go to the Department of Fish and Wildlife and knock on the door? No, I mean, local control, tribal local control means that the things that they do are more likely to be successful. The other thing that's interesting is that tribes have some political leeway to do interesting things. I have had a tribal hatchery manager tell me that he is violating the Endangered Species Act because they are working on improving the genetics of the salmon they produce so that they're more robust and more diverse in ways that they think that, like, the NOAA fisheries to approve that would have to take years. And they've said, you know what, we don't have years. We're going to do it now. I think that's really cool. The response I get to that is, well, but they're putting their gill nets and they're catching all these fish and they illegally catch. I hear those. I've asked people, I don't know how big an impact that is. It's hard for me to judge. Those anecdotes, they're probably true, but whether the tribes are overcatching is hard for me to assess. So, okay, so I hear that. But tribal hatcheries are some of the best hatcheries. And I think we can learn a lot, both from how they do things and the regulatory freedom that they have to get things done rather than go through bureaucratic processes.
It strikes me as similar to some of the comments I think you have made about forestry and the ways that, you know, when people have forests in their backyard or they're in charge of it, they don't want to just kill all the trees and then they're done and you lose that, because that's one, their livelihood, and two, they want to keep that legacy going for family and things like that. So I appreciate this perspective a lot.
Yeah, look at some of the best, healthiest forests, especially in Eastern Washington, are on tribal land.
Yeah.
Compare the tribal land to the federal land that's right next door, and there is no doubt who is doing a better job, and it's not the federal government.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your analysis here, Todd. We appreciate having you on the program as always.
It's always nice to be here. And if people have follow-up questions and get their question answered, feel free to email me. I'm happy to respond.
Yes, and make sure that you follow him on Twitter as well. I have his profile linked in the chat there, and you can enjoy the Chaucer-inspired satire of our very own residential Todd Myers. Thank you so much. All right, well, that is going to do it for this week. Thank you guys so much. And if you want to follow our work, make sure to visit washingtonpolicy.org. The blog there gets updated very frequently. Make sure to sign up for our newsletter. And if you are subscribed, make sure to send that to someone who you think can benefit from the information, because during the legislative session, it's very easy to have headlines with grabby, moves of legislation and laws. The rest of the year, a lot of important stuff happens too, and our researchers are on top of it. They are detailed, they are thorough, and they write really great stuff. So make sure you send that newsletter out. It's the easiest and best way to stay to date with the latest from Washington Policy Center. Thank you so much for tuning in this week, and we'll see you not next week, but in 2 weeks with our regular schedule of every other week. See you then, and thanks so much.